Okay, welcome to the Leadership Zone. My name is Sheila Walsh, and I host these conversations where we think about the things that leaders need to consider to be more effective and more inclusive and to have a greater impact. So today I have Richard Newman, and I'm going to get Richard to introduce himself and to tell us a little bit about his work so that we can kind of dive into that conversation a bit more. So welcome, Richard. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and then a little bit about the work that you're doing at the moment?
Sure. Thank you, Sheila. I'm Richard Newman. I'm the founder and CEO of Body Talk, and we teach people communication skills. So how to take often quite dry, complex information that people need to share with their teams or with their clients, and we show them how to make it clear, concise, compelling, engaging through nonverbal behavior, storytelling, enhancing their mindset, overcoming challenging objections, so they really get the results that they need day to day in business. And we're working with leadership teams, sales teams, people who are on MBA programs, and so on. At the moment, we have 20 people on our team, and we get booked about 2,000 times per year to go and work with people all the way around the world. So we're working across Europe, the Middle East, Asia, America, Australia, Africa, doing about 30% of that virtually, and the rest of it is there in person. And this is something I've been passionate about for a very long time. As the founder of the company, I spent 23 years building this company, and I never knew that I was going to be having a company of this size. It was really just a hobby. And the reason that it was a hobby is that, and I focused on communication, is because I always struggled with communication as a child. So when I was at school, I knew from an early age I was very shy. I worked out later on that I'm an introvert. And also more recently, a couple of years ago only, I got diagnosed with being autistic. And all of those things gave me a bit of a challenge around communication when I was younger, but I didn't know what that challenge really was. And simply put, a lot of people are on the autistic spectrum in different ways these days. It's very much been expanded to include more people. But for me, it simply means the way I think about communication, the way that I observe people is different to the way that most people, neurotypical people, would observe communication. And so I became fascinated with exploring my abilities to communicate better when I was younger. Back when I was a teenager, I started reading books on communication. I ended up reading about 200 books on communication between the age of 16 and about 25. I was constantly looking at them, things around body language, tone of voice, stage presence, anything that I could get that would help advance my communication skills. And as part of that journey, I ended up when I was 18 years old traveling to India, where I was living in the foothills of the Himalayas. I was living in a little Tibetan monastery, teaching English to Tibetan monks who didn't speak a word of English when I got there. So I was having to teach them entirely non-verbally, learning how to use body language and tone of voice to connect with people who didn't understand my words. And loved that process, and then studied acting for 3 years in London, and came out of there and just essentially started this hobby of teaching people communication skills. I started off in the back room of my hairdresser's salon, where my hairdresser said, "Could you teach my hairdressers how to have better communication skills?" I did that. And then by word of mouth, other clients started coming to me, and it got me to where I am today. And along this pathway, we've built up our own scientific research on communication that we can share with our clients and with leaders that we work with to enhance their impact.
That's fantastic. That's a brilliant intro. Like, it gives so many questions for people to ask. I think the first thing that I'm curious about, I might start with the last thing you said about the research and then come back to some of your other points. In terms of the research, what type of research was it, and what were you looking at in that research?
So from having read so many books on communication, I realized that there was a lot of things that had been covered sort of a few years ago in research, but there was elements that were missing. And as much as I looked at research and at books and so on, there was pieces that we were starting to teach our clients, because I'd been teaching clients for about 14 years. By the time I thought, I really want to make sure that what we're teaching here is validated scientifically, because we were seeing results for people internationally from what we were putting together and the way that we'd honed and redesigned our training based on what was working for people. But we wanted to make sure that it was really working universally. So we went to work with UCL, University College of London, who are world renowned for their research in psychology and influence. We worked with the head of psychology there, Professor Adrian Furnham, and also the head of statistics there, Alastair McClelland. And they've been doing research like this for over 30 years and helping put together and design and sort of co-author so many different studies. And so we worked with them over an 18-month period to design a study that would be really rigorous, that would give us universally proven elements that we can teach people about how to slightly change your communication style to radically improve your impact. And it was fascinating doing this process with them because, first of all, they said a study like you're talking about has never been done. They looked through the research that had been done over many decades to figure out what had been done that we could then build upon. And they also said, when we run this study, you may discover that what you're teaching doesn't do anything. In fact, it could be harming people's impact. And I said, that's completely fine. I just want to know for myself and for my clients if this is working or not. And so to create this study, what we did is we created a video of someone presenting information where they were speaking from a script, they were presenting, and at the end of this video, people would view this and they would rate this person based on how confident do you think this person is, how good a leader do you think they would be, would you vote for them in an election, and a whole range of other elements. And to make sure that this was universally validated, firstly, we changed the presenter from one video to the next. So we got them to stay exactly the same in that their clothing was the same, the words they were saying were the same, their non-verbal delivery was as identical as we could make it. But in some videos we had a man, sometimes we had a woman, sometimes they were older, sometimes they were younger. And what we found, to our complete surprise, is it actually didn't matter what the gender or the skin color or the age of the presenter was. It didn't change their ratings, which went against our hypothesis. We thought that those things would change things. We also found that it didn't matter where we did the study. So we would get people to watch these videos based across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. And we found that if we got a 65-year-old woman in California to watch a video, and we got an 18-year-old man in Mumbai to watch the same video, the ratings they were giving, there was no statistically significant difference between those ratings, which again really surprised us. We thought there would be a difference in who was in the video and who was watching the video. But those things didn't impact it. What did impact it is that for each of our presenters, we got them to embody various habits we see people using and leaders using day to day when they do a pitch, presentation, a speech, that sort of thing, and the most common habits. And then we gradually changed them video by video across to what we thought might be the most effective style based on what we were teaching people. And so to be clear, in every video they said the same words, in every video they wore the same clothes. We just slightly changed the non-verbal behavior. And what we found is that if you shift from the most common habits that you see people embodying every day, you gradually shift that across to what we found was the most effective behavior. You can go into your next meeting, you can go into your next pitch or presentation, you can say exactly the same words, you can be the same person, but by making a couple of small changes, you can increase how convincing your message is by 42%. Which is extraordinary if you think about what that can do for sales teams managing to increase the number of people convinced by the same product, the same message. It also increased how good a leader someone was perceived to be by 44%, and it increased how many people would vote for you in an election by around 58%. And genuinely, when we started doing this study, we thought if we could show 7% difference, that would be massive, and we could really roll this out and impress people. And so I remember the day in which Alistair McClelland, who is a statistician, he came to me in a coffee shop in London. We're all meeting there after the study had been run. And he passed me a piece of paper and his hand was shaking. And I said, "Are you okay? What's happening with you?" He said, "Take a look at these numbers." And I looked at them, and I'm not a statistician. They didn't mean anything to me. And I said, "Well, what am I looking at?" He said, "In order for your study to be valid, in order for it to have something interesting in there that we've proven, you need a number on this page above the number 1. And you've got a 16. And I've never seen that in my career. And that just goes to show how rigorous the study was and how much you've been able to transform the situation based on those nonverbal behaviors. And we've been teaching people about that ever since. And what I really like about it, the most fascinating piece for me, is it's not about becoming something that you're not. Sometimes people think, oh, body language is about faking it, or it's about sort of, nail varnish. It's just like this thing on top, or it's a manipulation. What we found is actually the most effective way to communicate is if you get rid of your habits, if you get rid of your armor in the way that you communicate, and you just come back to how you were born to stand, how you were born to sit, how you were born to breathe, how you're born to gesture. If you go back to those impulses, then suddenly you radically improve your impact. And that's what we've been sharing with people ever since.
That's really interesting, because the researcher in me has like a number of questions about the fact that identity didn't make a difference. I'm like, that contradicts a lot of current research. But when you describe it in this way, what you're describing is the removal of defenses, which is what we develop and adapt. And by removing those, you're considered more trustworthy and you're more impactful. Now, that doesn't go against the current research, because what you're doing is you're removing the leaking that occurs as human beings, person to person. So that's really interesting. Like, I'm really curious about that from a research point of view, because yeah, and I like the point that you're making about the authenticity, because I think that's one of the big issues lots of people have when they do any development around leadership or around any kind of development, this idea that they must fake something. I personally reject that idea, but also the idea that by learning to do something more effectively, we're not being ourselves. And that makes me often think about the link between how we see our identity through, you know, how we label our behavior and the ways that we live in the world. So that's really interesting. And I'm sure listeners are going to be delighted to hear something like that, because I know being impactful in communication is such an important thing for anyone, but especially for anyone in any type of influencing or leadership role. I suppose what I'm now thinking about is, because I really love your idea about your point about not being very good at communication and finding out you're autistic, identifying as an introvert. I think these are really important things to think about, why some people are driven in a direction of curiosity and others aren't. And I think that often very successful people, we don't always describe maybe some of the challenges because of the associations that can be made with those challenges, right? So I'm really curious about how you think being autistic may have actually strengthened your approach, your curiosity, your insights, and have kind of supported you getting to where you are at the moment.
Yes, it's one of those things that actually I find it's incredibly useful. So there's a few things to say around this. Often I've heard speakers or trainers say this, that the best material you can ever come up with is teaching people what you wish you'd known 5 years ago. So whatever you've been learning, whatever's been important to you, you're suddenly going to be passionate about, and you're going to have some valid information to share. So that's a good direction to go in. And for me, when I'm coaching people around that piece of identity, I find it helps for people that if I open up and say, look, I've come from this background of being shy, introvert, or autistic, because sometimes I get people saying, oh, it's all very well for you, Richard. You're a natural communicator, and I'm never going to be able to do that. I can't gesture. I can't move my arms when I speak to people. And I'll say to them, so first of all, I've had challenges myself in figuring out communication. But secondly, when we think about identity, it's really important to understand the difference between who you really are, your full potential, and your current habits. So sometimes people say, well, the way that I communicate is that I sit on my hands and I speak in a monotone, and that's who I am. And I say to them, no, that's your current habits. You're stuck in a rut, and you are representing less than 1% of who you really are with all of your potential. All I'm asking you to do is just put down some of your current habits and feel out some of the greater expanse of your potential, so you can really understand all that you could do and all the people that you could impact. So I think that's critical. Then to look into autism itself, as I mentioned, it's an area that I'm only really starting to understand myself. It was a big surprise to me when I got the diagnosis, but it did make a lot of sense. And I think the way that it's really helped me in communication is that the best example, a couple of examples I can give people of what it's like for me, is if you imagine being an observer on the outside of a goldfish bowl and just watching the fish inside there swim around. They don't seem to need any lessons to know how to swim. They don't need any lessons in how to breathe underwater. They just do it. They figure that stuff out. And I'm on the outside looking in thinking, how are they doing that? I would never understand how to do these things. I'd really have to figure it out. I'd have to get some training in this and so on. So that's what sometimes communication has looked like for me. But it's also meant that I've been able to look at communication as an outside observer in all sorts of social contexts, professional contexts for so many years, looking at the behavior that's happening, almost like if you can imagine David Attenborough looking at a herd or a tribe of a certain animal and just analyzing, well, what is going on between one member of the tribe and another member of the tribe? And does that work and does that not work? And what can we learn from this? So I've had a lot of that happening where through trial and error, I've had to figure out what is it exactly that makes this communication work. And so by looking at that and working out if it was working for me, if it works for my clients, and then putting it into this scientific study, allowed me to figure out things that other people weren't seeing. Because for other people, they're from my perspective, they're the fish in the goldfish bowl. They just breathe underwater, and either they can do it or they can't do it, but they're not on the outside looking in. And so there's ways in which we put this into practice, where sometimes you'll get people running a course on presence and gravitas, for example. And I've seen that there are some speakers, some trainers who do this, who they have always, since they're a very young age, been the person who is invited to speak in front of the class and had that presence, and they've been the go-to person as the authority figure. And then someone says, hey, run a class on this because you're so good at it. And they're actually not quite sure how they do it. They just know that they have it. And their instruction to people might be, go out there and have more presence. And people say, well, how do I do that? Whereas I've been on the outside looking in thinking, if someone does have presence, what exactly are they doing physically or vocally different? What is different in their behavior that is creating that? Can I see any consistencies that are happening universally? And therefore, can I teach that to people? So it's been really useful for me to break that down. And sometimes if I'm coaching someone in their communication style, they'll say to me, what I really need is to have greater engagement and influence with this type of person. And for me, it's almost like when I'm observing their communication style, it's like looking at a wall and thinking, okay, these 4 bricks are missing. We need to put those 4 bricks into place and then you're good. And so it's been incredibly useful to have that kind of analytical mind, if you like, an outside observer's mind, to then bring extra resources in a way that other people may not have spotted those things in the first place.
That's really interesting. And I love to hear how any diagnosis, anybody's experience actually might be part of a fuller experience for them in their lives, rather than just always seeing something as something that needs correcting or adapting or adjustments. While those things are important too, there's also a fullness that I have found comes with people being able to see the world in different ways and therefore seeing solutions that might be harder to reach. So I really love hearing that. I find it really exciting because I think, like you said, the assumption that someone's good at something, meaning that they understand how it works, is very different to somebody understanding how something works and having to learn how to do it. And, you know, we didn't all learn to ride our bike easily, you know, and so the person who did might not be able to explain how to hold gravity or to, you know, or to work with the weight because they're just intuitively doing that. So I really love your examples. I think they can open people's minds as well, because I work with lots of leaders who actually get diagnoses like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, might have addiction, like there's loads of things, and they say, oh, I can't tell anyone. And I'm like, do you realize you're probably really good at this thing because that has in some way given you a lens that maybe might not be the average lens that people use. And so I think it's really important to think about ourselves in a more holistic way. So I really love those examples. Tell me a little bit about who kind of comes to you for work, how you work with them, and where people could follow up and contact you if this is ringing true for them.
Sure. So the main people who tend to come to us are people who they've been in the working world for a little while, and then they get promoted to a certain level of, it could be middle manager, senior manager, all the way up to CEO, but they get promoted to a level where suddenly they need to be more of an ambassador of their company. They need to be leading a team, or they need to be going and speaking to clients, and they need more of those communication skills in that space. So if you take an example of, say, an engineering company, people might start working there because they've got this brilliant engineering mind. And gradually, if they're really good at what they do, they get promoted to be a manager of the engineers or a leader of a certain team. And then suddenly they need skills beyond just being an engineer. They need to know, how do I lead? How do I influence? How do I inject a sense of motivation or inspiration towards people? How do I engage them and roll out new initiatives in a way that they've understood it? And so we often go in and work. And quite typically, we work with people from a technical background, which might be engineering, construction, the pharmaceutical world, telecoms, IT, that sort of thing, where they've got technical information they might need to share with non-technical people. But beyond that, we also work with marketing companies and retail and all sorts of exciting different brands. But it is at that stage where whenever communication becomes critical, making sure that you've got the skills to do that. And it's been interesting how it's changed over the years, because 23 years ago, it was public speaking was the piece we were focusing on, people standing behind a lectern and speaking to a large audience, and we were encouraging them away from a lectern and getting them to really connect. And then more recently, it has been more about one-to-one communication. How do you really effectively engage with one person, which has been much more important since the pandemic. People have spent less time together. We've spent more time virtually with people, if you like. And so having that brilliant one-to-one skill is often where we spend our time. And like I mentioned earlier, we do it virtually, we do it in person. If anyone wants to get in touch, they can find us at ukbodytalk.com. And we do conference speeches, we do small group workshops, we do one-to-one sessions. And for me, it's all about the passion that I have, that I care about so deeply, because I needed to do it for myself. It's about helping people find their voice so that they can be heard, they can get the respect and results they really deserve when they speak, And in some small way, it allows me and my team to tilt the world in a more positive direction so that people really feel heard and seen when they speak and that they matter.
That's fabulous, because like, what better kind of vision or mission to have behind your work, that actually it's about helping people have a better experience. And I think communication is so tricky because it's not about what you say or do necessarily, it's about what's understood, because at the end of the day, that's the point. That isn't always the easiest thing to develop personally, because we usually replicate what we prefer or we replicate what we've witnessed. And so it makes a lot of sense that when communication is critical, getting support to think about how you're being experienced by the other person and how you might be able to adapt to make that a more effective or positive experience. So before I let you go, would you answer a couple of kind of key questions that we try to ask people on the Leadership Zone? So one question for you first is just, do you have an example of a great leader in your opinion, and why do you perceive them as a great leader?
Sure. I mean, a couple of examples come to mind. That always comes to mind, and I don't want to divide people politically. I'm not a political sort of person, but I really admired Barack Obama in the way that he led. I think particularly because he's such a great communicator. When I ask people around the world, whatever political background they have, I ask them who's been a great speaker on the world stage in the last 20 years. He comes up over and over and over again, and I really admired his spirit and the way that he dealt with various different situations of being able to be that inspiring go-to communicator who could tell a story in a way that would emote the right reaction, that would drive people to move things forward. So I really like that. The other one I've been really enjoying recently, I've been reading the book Turn the Ship Around, which is by David Marquet, and it's just superb. It's about, for people who don't know, it's about somebody who is working in the Navy, and he was expecting to go and be the commander of a particular submarine, and then suddenly he was switched to a submarine that he didn't know about, he didn't understand, he didn't know what the buttons did, and he suddenly had to go and lead this team that was not performing well. They were the worst performing submarine crew, if I'm getting the words right, in the Navy, and he transformed it for them to be the best team that was in the Navy in the space of a couple of years. So I found his work really inspiring, the way that he listened to them and empowered people and had great conversations with them to be a great leader.
I love those two examples for the two reasons that you've shared. So I'm wondering, is there a quote that you kind of love or you think that the listeners might find some support in? Is there any kind of quote that you particularly like?
I think that the phrase, if you like, that comes to mind, which is not attributed to anybody in particular, but it's more a sense of how I like to look at leadership, is that leadership is really about lifting others, to allow everybody else around you to be the best version of themselves. And I think that has really helped me as I've led a team through various different challenges. We're in the live events business, and the entire business was shut down by the pandemic. And I went through the 2008 financial crisis where people stopped booking soft skills and so on. And so I've had to go through various different challenges as a leader. And sometimes there's been a lot of pressure on me in many ways. And I think people can go in different directions. They can either sort of take over, or they can elevate the people around them and help everybody do their best work, in which case, it drives everyone forward. So it's that sort of feeling around leadership that I always aim to emulate.
I love that. And I'd have a similar position on it. So I'm wondering, do you have any pet peeves about the workplace or leadership that you'd share with the listeners? Is there anything you're like, oh, I think the new term is that gives me the ick, apparently, I found out. Is there anything that you're like, oh, that really is a pet peeve of mine?
I think something that comes to mind that I see occasionally is that sometimes a person who is in a leadership position, the leadership position can go to their head. It can feed their ego a little bit. And also they may be put in a leadership position because they're very good at something. So often you see that people get promoted in an organization because they are the best salesperson, or they're the best engineer, or they're the best marketeer, and so on. And so they've got great skills, and then they get to the point of being the leader. And when something needs to be done, they can potentially brag about their ability to do things, and sometimes just dive in and take over and do that particular task, because they feel, and possibly rightly, that they can do it better than other people around because they've got more experience. But it's really demotivating for everybody else. And so I will often discourage people, if I'm coaching them for an event, discourage them away from sort of bragging or needing to sort of prove, hey, this is the reason why I'm the leader, and move them more towards that space of, you need to get to a place where you're lighting up everybody else through what you're doing.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I'm going to ask you, is there any last piece of parting advice you'd leave our listeners with?
Sure. So this was a piece that actually I covered it in my last book, which I think is maybe the best part about the book, which is that I talked about how I've experienced this in my life, and I encourage other people to do this, is that occasionally in my life, someone has shown up where they have really seen my greatness, is the way that I phrase this, is that they've seen my ability to do something that I didn't believe that I could do. So, for example, as mentioned earlier, that the first job I ever did teaching communication was working in a hairdressing salon. And I was just sitting there in the salon getting my hair cut. And this hairdresser was saying, "Hey, what do you do?" And I talked about my background, reading these books on communication, and been teaching monks and studied acting. And he said, "If I give you a free haircut, could you come and teach my team? Because I really believe this is something you'd be amazing at." And he saw something in me that I didn't know I could do. And only a week earlier, I'd gone into a recruitment agency and they said, "The only thing you're qualified for doing is lifting furniture, that you're not qualified for anything else." And I came out of there really demoralized, but I came out of having my haircut thinking, he's seen something in me that I'm scared to do, quite frankly. I'd love to think that I could do it. I don't even think I can do this. And eventually he persuaded me to do it. And I love the fact that he did that. And a couple more people have done that throughout my life. They've seen something in me I didn't know was there, and they've helped me bring that part to life. So I would say that to business leaders. I'd say that to people in general. If you can see greatness in somebody else, tell them that it's there, help them believe that that is there. And you may never know what that may lead to. I'm sure my hairdresser didn't realize I'd go on to train 130,000 people or have this big team around me. So you never know the impact you can have just by seeing someone's greatness.
I love that as a parting point. I have no other words. Thank you for joining us today. And I'll put all the notes and all the ways that people can get in contact with you in the show notes. Again, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing those pieces. I'm sure it's going to be really beneficial for listeners.